We will begin recording. And for those, just a disclaimer, I am a Black Muslim woman, psychologist, researcher, but I'm also a community member. And in total transparency and honesty, this was very challenging work to do because the illusion of objectivity, I say, is a tool of white supremacy. And so while I'm trying to understand the impact on my community, I'm also experiencing it, I'm living it. And so are the members of this research team. And so for those who either do not share one of those identities, this may be an experience that is new. And for those who are watching, who's a member of the Black or African American community, I would say pause when you need to, or step back from the presentation because it's very heavy. There are moments that are incredibly sobering, and there are also moments that are inspiring, that speak to the strength and resilience of this community. But it's a lot to experience and also to then begin to process and understand. So that's my disclaimer to all of those, to take care of yourself, even as you're sort of watching and taking in this information. So just a brief overview of what you can expect from this webinar. The members of the team will introduce themselves, and then we'll provide a brief sort of background or context that will help sort of frame why this research is important, and also what are the experiences that are pre-existing, that predate COVID-19. And it is important to keep that historical perspective in mind because these aren't sort of new concerns or new stressors. They're exacerbated by a pandemic, a global pandemic. And Dr. Bediako will present the methodology and the results. And then we'll talk about what were some of the implications or some of the themes that we discovered both from the quantitative information and the qualitative responses to the survey. So Dr. Bediako and Imam Abdulmalik, if you could just introduce yourself and say a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Right, Assalamu alaikum. I'm trying to share start my video, but I'm unable to do so. Okay. In the interest of time, I can go ahead. I think the voice is more important than the face anyway at this point. Okay. But Assalamu alaikum. I am very honored to be here this evening to take part in this webinar. My name is Shawn Bediako, and I am on leave from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where I'm a full professor of psychology. Again, just as a point of transparency, as a Black Muslim male, this was indeed a labor of love, but it was also definitely a collective effort, both on the part of the team, but also with respect to the respondents. So this was one of the things that you'll see is that a lot of folks who are doing work on COVID-19 or doing surveys around it are heavily funded. This was, we had a budget of $0. And so everything that you see is literally just built from the ground up. So I'm one of those academics who understands how privileged I am to be able to use knowledge for insight and transformation. And that's what I'm hoping, inshallah, that the collective results of our efforts will help to provide insight into the experiences that Black Muslims are having with COVID and Black people in general are having with COVID, and also provide some ways in which we can start thinking about what are the transformative practices that need to take place in order to help us cope, adjust, and heal to this situation.
Thank you so much. And I think that's worth reiterating, that a budget of $0, but a lot of passion, a lot of dedication to gather this information for both our own sort of understanding, right, to make meaning, but also so that the impact, right, isn't sort of forgotten. And it's important that we are who we are in doing this research. Imam Abdulmalik, if you could also introduce yourself and what you do.
Absolutely. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and welcome. My name is Abdul Malik Merchant. I serve as the Muslim chaplain at Tufts University, as well as the Muslim chaplain at the Essex County Sheriff's Department, which is a county jail in on the North Shore of Massachusetts. It's been an honor to be a part of this team, focusing primarily on the religious and spiritual perspective. From my academic training, I have a master's in theological studies with a concentration on practical theology. And so my work on this team has been primarily trying to look at the religious effects of COVID on Black people, and how sort of analyze some of the qualitative data around that is. It's been an honor. Again, just as transparent as everyone else mentioned, I am a Black male, husband and father. And so this has definitely been very, very impactful. But also for me, particularly looking at the spiritual side of things, very, very inspiring to see how our community has been able to dig into our faith traditions, Muslim and otherwise, and find meaning and healing and wellness despite the temporary challenges we see ourselves living in.
Absolutely. So this section is really going to provide, again, a context. What is the backdrop that, when there are sort of discussions around COVID being sort of the great equalizer, what we see is this is not true. In fact, that there are vulnerabilities that our communities have been coping with for centuries, right? And so we understand that the impact of white supremacy, of anti-Black racism, is always in the background, is always operating. And so we need to have an understanding of what this means now that we add, right, to that backdrop, a novel virus that the world has never seen before. And I think as of today, we're approaching about 190,000 Americans who have died, unfortunately, and countless numbers of people who are connected to those loved ones who have been lost. So this is, I think, the words escape me to describe how profound this is. And so using sort of these visual images and these headlines, I think really capture, one, the sense of how overwhelming it is, but also the history and the context that's necessary. So, of course, the disparate impacts are not a story about race. They're a story about racism, right? And most of these headlines are from the last 5 to 7 days. So not even reaching back into March, April, May. These are primarily just the first few days of September. The COVID-19 death rate among African Americans and Latinos is rising sharply. New figures show that both total number of deaths and per capita death rates have increased dramatically. There is somewhat of a sense, because there is emphasis on reopening states to, outdoor and indoor dining, somehow, at times it conveys that this is no longer a problem or is no longer as urgent as it was perhaps in March, but this is not the case. People are still becoming infected and people are still dying, unfortunately. So it's very serious. In the age of COVID-19, aging while Black is more dangerous than ever, from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Elderly, ill, and Black in a pandemic. I'm doing everything I can not to get this virus, from CNN, September 1st. Coronavirus is making the return to school a tough test for Black families. We could have a whole entire discussion about what does it mean for how this is impacting the education and the learning of our young people, or all learners, to be honest. Racial disparities in home ownership rates contribute to wealth gap and impacts of COVID-19. So again, not just in the areas of health and education, but also when we start to dig into, well, what is the economic implications, home ownership, wealth gap. Employer-sponsored health insurance contributes to structural racism. Again, a pre-existing, right, condition of America, if you can kind of term it that way, that America has certain pre-existing conditions, and the conditions that have been present since its founding is steeped in white supremacy, anti-Blackness, of the subjugation and the murder of both enslaved Africans and indigenous people, And they still have implications today. Going viral, COVID-19, environmental injustice, and institutionalized racism. Again, impacting all of these domains. From NBC News, Black female inmates and COVID-19, medically compromised, vulnerable, and neglected. So we cannot forget those who are currently detained, incarcerated, under some kind of, directly impacted by the carceral state. There are prisons in this country that are COVID hotspots and people are dying. But because of those individuals being in those particular spaces, there often isn't enough attention paid to the impact in that area. And again, the community members who are connected to those incarcerated individuals also feel this impact. So that provided sort of just, again, a glimpse of all of the different areas in which COVID-19 is impacting us. But again, we're not just simply dealing with a pandemic, right? There is a pandemic within a pandemic, and that is of racial violence, of police brutality. So this is from the New York Times, the pandemic within a pandemic, coronavirus and police brutality, royal Black communities. Facing both COVID-19 and racism, Black women are carrying a particularly heavy burden. So again, we'll talk in our results and also who our respondents are about how Black women are shouldering an immense burden, both in the care and the direct impact as a result of coronavirus. An era of peril for Black mental health, racial injustice, and the coronavirus pandemic have punctuated the mental health burden of many Black Americans. And this is from US News and World Report. Depression and anxiety spiked among Black Americans after George Floyd's death. Again, this is from Washington Post. And finally, the Philadelphia Inquirer, when police kill Black people, the whole community suffers. Experts offer coping strategies. Again, coping strategies for this pandemic, while also having to contend with the disparate impact of this health pandemic of coronavirus. Police mocked Black man's Muslim faith as they killed him. So this was happened months ago, but the footage emerged just in August, again, as we still see ongoing protests. And so again, impacting Black communities of different ethnic and religious backgrounds. And so again, along with the history and the context and the pandemic within the pandemic, what are we seeing specifically from the data that is available about the impact of COVID-19 on Black Americans? So APM Research Lab, American Public Media, has been trying to keep track of what is being released of information regarding race and ethnicity, and also sort of age-related disparities that we're witnessing. So Black and Indigenous Americans experience highest death tolls from COVID-19. And this statistic, again, as of mid to late August, I think is also particularly sobering, that 1 in 1,125 Black Americans has died, compared to 1 in 2,450 white Americans. Why is that significant? Black Americans are only about 14% of the population, but we're seeing this higher rate of infection and also of death. So if Black Americans were dying at the same actual rate as white Americans, about 19,500 Black people, 8,400 Latino, 600 Indigenous, and 70 Pacific Islander Americans would still be alive. So just think about that. If Black Americans were dying at the same actual rate as white Americans, almost 20,000 of us would still be alive today. And that's as of mid to late August. We're now into September. And so when we're trying to understand how are we coping, how are we understanding, right, these numbers, right? The numbers paint a picture, but we also want to understand what is our community articulating, what are we expressing about what these numbers indicate to us. So understanding the higher rate of infection, the health disparities, the police brutality, the racial violence, the structural inequities which predate COVID-19, those can be framed as social toxins for Black Americans. What is social toxicity? This refers to the extent to which the social environment in which individuals or families develop and operate is poisonous, right? Racial trauma and violence is poisonous. Structural inequities are poisonous, right? In the sense that it contains serious threats to the development of identity, competence, trust, and the other features of personality and ideology that make for success in school, family, work, and the community. So what are the social and cultural poisons that are psychologically equivalent to lead and smoke in the air, right? It looks like this for us, right? White supremacy. And these are just some examples, right? This is not an exhaustive list, but white supremacy and capitalism, incarceration, detention, monitoring, and surveillance, anti-Muslim bigotry and violence, anti-Black racism, racial trauma and violence, Christian hegemony. And I think this point is worth pausing here, that the association or the correlation or the connection between white Christianity and white supremacy is also on display today. And so we have to be mindful of the ways in which Christianity has been used to also subjugate Black Americans, and that it has also the history of the founding of this nation is also intertwined with that ideology, and we can't forget that. So the Black COVID Survey Project really endeavored to understand the impact of these toxins, how are people responding to the toxins, and what do we need? Where are there gaps? So again, this is a collaboration between Muslim Wellness Foundation, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and the Black Muslim COVID Coalition. And this, again, this coalition was founded in March, really to look at how are we understanding our community's needs when we aren't often talking about the religious diversity of African Americans. And so what do we need to understand also about the similarities and the differences between how this novel virus is impacting those communities. So Dr. Bediako, if you could begin by explaining the methodology and the results that we were able to gather.
Sure. So this study was put together, again, as I mentioned earlier in my comments, as a collective effort of all of us involved today in this webinar. Was driven very strongly by Sister Dr. Kameelah. But what we did was we created an online survey that was distributed to a convenient sample of people who self-identified as being Black. They completed the survey between May 6th and June 14th of this year. So shortly, about 2 months into the pandemic, once things had started to shut down. The study was reviewed and approved by the IRB at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And all of the data was collected anonymously, as is mentioned here in the slide. We can go to the next slide, please. With respect to who the respondents are that we're talking about today. So I will note that we had over 1,000 or slightly more than 1,000 respondents, and 845 of those folks actually completed the survey. And of that 845, 311 were folks who self-identified as Muslim, and about 336 of them were self-identified as Christian. And I would note that for this group of folks who we're talking about today as Christians, that these are people who identify specifically as Protestant Christians. There were about 25 respondents who said that they were Catholic, and they are not included in this analysis that we're going to be talking about today. And as you see on the screen, the breakdown in terms of ethnicity is shown here, that the Christian sample was primarily Black American, and about 59%, 60% of the Muslim respondents were Black American, with a little more than a quarter also being Black African. So there are some differences with respect to ethnic composition of both of these groups. And so we want to keep those things in mind as we kind of talk. We don't want to talk specifically about Muslims and Christians as generalized categories, but also just keeping in mind that even within those groups, that there are a diverse range of folks from different ethnic backgrounds.
So an important note I just want to highlight very briefly, Dr. Bediako, is that the significance of this work is in the fact that we were able, one of the significant findings, I believe, is that we were able to engage almost comparable numbers of Black Muslims and Black Christians. And this is something that we do not find ordinarily in research on the African American community. And so for the benefit of those who may not know much about the American Muslim community, about 1 in 4 American Muslims identify as Black or African American. So there's a tremendous ethnic diversity within this faith community. And Black Muslims represent those, about a third of enslaved Africans, according to historians, were Muslim, and that US-born descendants of enslaved Africans in the US and Caribbean, as well as immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean, are included in this present day number. Also, it's important to highlight that 63% of US-born Muslims are convert to Islam, and many of those identify as African American. This is a very quick, just again, overview of why it is important to include this level of religious diversity in the work that we're doing on the African American community because of intersectional invisibility. Valerie Purdy-Vaughns and others have talked about what it means for a community of individuals to have multiple marginalized identities. And so it's represented for Black Muslims in this visual, that typically when we're talking about Black or African Americans, as a result of the universality of Christianity and also Christian privilege, Christian hegemony, African American is also often seen as synonymous with Christian, and this is not true. And so on the other side, that when we're talking about American Muslims, in sort of the public imagination, American Muslims are Arab or South Asian, and they're also foreign, immigrant, brown, and Arab and Muslim are often used interchangeably or synonymously, again, which is false. They should not be. And so this depicts why it is important for us to be very explicit about the identities of our participants and be intentional about how we recruit and sort of engage communities that otherwise would not be represented. So I'm going to pass it back over to you. I just wanted to kind of insert that so it provides additional context for those who are listening.
Sure, no problem. Thank you. Just to continue on with the description of the sample, as you can see, the predominant number of people who completed the survey identified as female. So roughly about 77% of the Christian sample identified as female, and about 71%, 72% of the Muslim sample identified as female. We had some folks who identified outside of the gender binary, and interestingly, about 2.3% of Muslims did not answer that question, compared to about 1.5% of Christians. We can go to the next slide, please. Again, with respect to sexual orientation, the predominant proportion of respondents of both religions actually indicated that they were straight or heterosexual, which there was about 94% of Muslims who responded to this question in that manner, as compared to about 82% of the Christian sample. Just to highlight some of the other key demographics, the sample was highly educated, but there was still some differences between the two religious groups. So about 70% of Muslims indicated that they had completed a 4-year college degree or higher, compared to about 84, almost 85% of Christians. The Muslim respondents were more likely to be married, and a higher proportion of Muslim respondents also indicated that they had children, compared to Christian respondents. One of the things that, again, we're just presenting some of the descriptive data, so we're not trying to infer too much from these, but we're just showing you a brief overview of what the numbers entail. with respect to the quantitative data. But one of the things that jumped out at us was the fact that the employment experiences vary quite a bit by religion. So when we asked folks to indicate whether or not they were currently employed full time, it was interesting that about 70% of the Christian samples indicated that they were employed full time, compared to only about 47% of the Muslim sample. Also, relatively speaking, even though this was not a statistically significant difference, but proportionately speaking, there were more Muslims who reported that they had been laid off from their job because of COVID. Similarly, a slightly higher proportion of Muslim respondents indicated that they were classified as an essential employee, and more Christian than Muslim respondents indicated that they were able to work from home. So of course, this is among those who were employed. Now, when we start to talk about the personal experiences that people had with COVID, which is on the next slide, at the time of the survey assessment, the great majority of respondents had shown no COVID symptoms personally. So more than 80% of folks in both religious groups indicated that they were unaffected by COVID, or that they had not had or had not shown any COVID symptoms. A similar proportion of people indicated that they had some symptoms but had not been formally tested for COVID. And a very small number of folks indicated that they were actually currently diagnosed with COVID at the time. So, and with respect to the last question that you'll see to the right of the screen, if we could go back one, I'm sorry. The number of people who were diagnosed with COVID but recovered, there was a significant, there was not a significant difference between the two religious groups here. However, as I'll show a little bit later, when we start talking about the social impact, which is coming up next, we see some differences here about the impact of COVID. So the key takeaway from this slide is that most people did not have direct personal experiences with COVID at the time of the survey administration. However, as we'll go to the next slide, you will see that there's going to be some differences with respect to how COVID has impacted their network of friends and family members. So here at the far left end, you'll see that respondents who were Christian and respondents who were Muslim both responded at about the same proportion, that they didn't have any friends or family members who currently had COVID. However, almost a third of both groups reported that they had friends or family members who had symptoms, but again, were not formally tested for COVID. And what's interesting here is that about half of, or about 50% of respondents in both groups indicated that they had friends or family members who had had COVID at that time, but had recovered. And a higher proportion of Christian respondents indicated that they had friends or family members who had actually passed away from COVID. And if we'll go to the next slide, we can kind of break this down even more quantitatively. As you'll see in the second group from the top, of the number of folks who had COVID but recovered, these are the raw numbers. And again, these are mean values. But on average, Christian respondents indicated that they knew 18 people who had had COVID but recovered from it, compared to Muslim respondents who indicated about less than 3, or about 3 people in their social networks or in their network of friends and family members who had had COVID but recovered. Both groups had similar responses on all of the other indices, as you can see here, with the number of folks who had passed away from COVID, with those who currently had COVID, and those who showed symptoms of COVID but had not been tested. Now, to dig a little bit deeper, we also asked a question about whether or not people had to go without things that they needed because they were short on money during this, because of COVID. As you can see, the majority of respondents indicated no, they did not have to go without things that they needed. However, a slightly larger proportion of Muslim respondents indicated yes, sometimes they had to do that. And an even a similar larger proportion of Muslim respondents indicated yes, that they often had to do that. Now, in terms of quantitative measures, because again, with somewhat of this being related to the budgeting issues, the survey itself was actually quite brief, but we did include some quantitative measures that kind of reflect some commonly used instruments or measurements that are used in health research or epidemiologic research. We use the perceived stress scale. We use the life orientation test revised, which is a measure of dispositional optimism, or how much people expect positive things to happen in the future. And we had some one-item measures that just looked at the extent to which people worried about being exposed to COVID and their confidence in accessing the healthcare system. And I'm not going to go into detail on all of these measures, but I just wanted to highlight a few of the findings from some of these measures, broken down by gender and by religion. So with respect to perceived stress, interestingly, we see that there is a main effect, and this is statistically significant, that there's a main effect for gender with respect to perceived stress, meaning that women tended to report higher levels of stress than men. But we also see some slight differences, again, because these are just descriptive data, and we can just kind of speculate about inferring what these data mean. But it's interesting to note here on the slide that male Muslims actually reported the lowest level of perceived stress. We asked a couple of questions about mental health services, about whether people were actually looking for therapy or for counseling, if they were currently in therapy or counseling, and if they had ever sought mental health counseling. And you can see the respondents here, how this breaks down. What this slide indicates is that a slightly higher proportion of Christian participants answered affirmatively on all three of these indices. When we asked folks about the extent to which they were worried about COVID exposure in their jobs, again, this sort of looked similar to how people responded to the questions about stress. Although, this looks like that there are some significant differences, but it's not just because of the scale that we use. The numbers here go from 0 to 3. So people reported relatively low levels of worry about their COVID exposure on their jobs. However, again, just descriptively, male Muslim respondents tended to worry the least about this. So just to summarize the quantitative data, the Muslim sample in our study represents a very diverse range of ethnicities and Islamic theology. So even when we talk about people who are Muslim, even within that group, there are people who, I think the majority of respondents identified as Sunni Muslims, about 64%, but people responded across a broad range with respect to the type of Islam that they practice. The employment experiences were significantly different for Muslims compared to Christians. And I think that when we try to assess outcomes related to COVID-19, what these data indicate is that the use of an intersectional approach is definitely warranted, particularly with respect to religion and gender, as those two variables may interact in different ways to produce some very disparate outcomes among the participants in our sample. And then finally, even though this is not a quantitative summary, I think what our data speak to is that there's a need for qualitative approaches to verify and provide a greater nuance to what these data actually mean. And from there, I want to turn that back over to Sister Kameelah.
Dr. Bediako, I wonder if you could also just briefly mention that we did have a significant number of individuals respond to the survey who did not identify as either Christian or Muslim. So I wonder if you can, if people are wondering, right, like, well, what about those who don't fall into those categories? If you could just say briefly about that.
Right. So again, just for the purpose of this webinar, we're just talking about the Muslim and Christian difference, or as those two groups, because they constitute the larger majority of the 845 respondents. But the remaining almost 189 respondents who didn't identify with either religion or who were agnostic, their numbers look somewhat similar. The issue is that we start to get into some very small cell sizes for some of these analyses. So that's one of the reasons why we're not drawing direct comparisons among the three groups. Just because even the groups of people who are neither Christian nor Muslim also represent some very diverse backgrounds that could serve as some confounding variables.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that folks know that we were looking at gathering information from Black folks of all religious backgrounds, and this is what the data presented us with, and so this is what we're presenting on today. When we move into discussing, thank you for that, Dr. Bediako, and I'm sure there's a lot more that we could discuss in terms of what we found. But as you said, those were the significant findings, particularly looking at religion and gender as variables impacting what folks were able to share with us. So when we move to understanding again from the qualitative information that we gathered, impact and coping strategies. So we were looking at, what is the impact of COVID? But we were also asking questions like, overall, how are you coping with COVID-19? How has COVID-19 affected your work experience? How has it affected your religious practice? And then we also included this question of, is there anything else that you would like to share with us about your experience with COVID-19? So I want to invite Imam Abdulmalik to talk a little bit about, again, some of the impact, and by first offering some of the just terminology that we're using so that we're all on the same page in terms of understanding what that meant to us. So Imam Abdulmalik.
And Dr. Shawn, when we're speaking about white supremacy here, we're talking about an ideology rather, that centers white people, ideas, thoughts, beliefs, actions, and places them superior to people of color and our thoughts, ideas, beliefs, and actions. And so this is not only something that is recent, this is a political or social economic system where white people enjoy the structural advantage of their rights and other racial and ethnic groups do not, both at a collective and individual level. And so the reason why we focused on, as Dr. Kameelah has already mentioned, Black people specifically, because we are generally in the media, as we saw from the examples that were given, not focused in our research. Black folk are usually somewhat secondary given to ideas too. So this is why we want to just define that for us. And white privilege also becomes something that is based off of and built off of a white supremacist understanding. When white people are given privilege to that, then it becomes the unquestioned and unearned set of advantages, entitlements, benefits, and choices that are bestowed to people solely because they are white. And so these are some of the things that it makes then Black folks invisible. It then gives, as we have here from Peggy McIntosh, the invisible knapsack of special provisions and blank checks. It's to be white is to be the origin, is to not have to think of, to be white, not to think about it. And everything else is seen as everyone else is seen as an exception to that rule. There's an expect to be seen as an individual opposed to a collective. And so this is what we're talking about when we're talking about both white supremacy and white privilege. Now, for anti-Black racism, we're specifically talking about a two-part formation of both avoids blackness of value, and the systematically marginalized Black people and their issues. So we're talking about something that, again, is a product of both white supremacy and white privilege, because you can't have anti-Black racism. You cannot be racist unless you have a privilege and that is built off and born from a structure of white supremacy. And so this is a covert, structural, and systematic racism categorically predetermines the socioeconomic status of Blacks in the country. The structures held in place by anti-Black policies, institutions, and ideologies. Racial trauma. And these are racial trauma are cumulative effect of racism on a person's physical and mental health, also known as race-based trauma stresses. And they are historical intergenerational trauma, representative of cumulative emotional and psychological wounds across generations: enslavement, genocide, colonization, and transatlantic slave trade. And these racial traumas, I would like to add, also therefore impact our spiritual well-being, not only our physical and mental well-being, because we know that our spiritual wellness is built upon our physical and mental wellness as well. So now the impact of COVID-19. We've seen the impact of COVID-19 in primarily four main domains: the financial health, the family and community well-being, physical health, and psychospiritual well-being. And again, this is taken from the qualitative data that we had. These are the main areas that people discussed and brought up as what they were impacted the most by. And so just to give some snapshots, if you will, some vignettes as to what people were saying, these are quotes taken directly from the qualitative part of our study. And so, a 35-year-old Afro-Caribbean Christian woman said, "I'm a nurse. That means nothing in terms of accessibility should I become sick. They don't want to supply us with proper gear, would rather accuse us of stealing the gear they would rather accuse us of stealing gear we never in fact had in the first place." A 29-year-old African-American Christian female said, "I'm grateful to have a job during this time, but it basically distracts me from dealing with my feelings about living through this pandemic. I'm resentful and grateful at the same time." A 36-year-old African-American Christian female said, "My husband is a small business owner, and although there is news about funding and programs advertised with creditors for relief, I think overall he feels unsupported by the government and economic community." A 33-year-old Afro-Caribbean Christian female said, "I am concerned about going back to work. Having to take the train once we go back, 18 of my coworkers tested positive. One died. Is the office clean? I know they have housekeeping there, but what about the spaces with most contact? Will they enforce social distancing in the office?" Again, these are just real, taking from what people said. This is what someone was feeling, a 33-year-old Afro-Caribbean Christian female, about going back to work. A 68-year-old African-American Christian woman said, "Being older, quite afraid of being perceived as not worth saving in a status of thrown away person. I'm aware of ageism, but the pandemic has intensified such feelings in me and many of my peers. Now, take this and put on top of it everything that we've mentioned about racism, take on top of that the generational historical traumas that this amazing woman may have been feeling, and now put onto that being feel, as she said, quote unquote, thrown away. A 72-year-old African-American woman said, "I'm tired of being labeled most likely to die first because I am poor, Black, and elderly." How does that make one feel? This, though this is not the picture of the woman, that looks like my late grandmother. This is how would it feel if in our yearbook or in our communal society we're being labeled most likely to die first. A 20-year-old African-American Muslim man said, "I have been extremely demoralized lately to have witnessed the significant uptick in police brutality, white supremacy, and utter disregard of Black and brown people and communities amidst the pandemic. Feeling like whatever we do, there is a permanent target on our backs for merely existing." A 38-year-old East African Muslim woman said, "I have surges of anxiety. The disparities Black folks are experiencing in infection, testing, and treatment have reinforced the general anti-Blackness in this country." A 54-year-old African-American Christian man said, "I feel safer being indoors and feel safe that my family has to stay indoors. This is due to police brutality and other ways domestic terrorists affect the Black community." A 43-year-old African Caribbean Muslim woman said, "The stress of COVID has been exacerbated by the disproportionate loss of life in my community. The sustained aggravated assault on Black bodies by the police and by systematic racism and racist rhetoric in this country. I have been especially traumatized by the visible killing of George Floyd and insidious video of Central Park Karen." So I'll transition over to Dr. Kameelah.
So I I want to pause there because I know we're just reading the reflections, the testimonies, as Dr. Bediako calls them, of participants in this survey. But I think it's worth sort of highlighting that, again, as researchers, we're also living this experience. And for me to go through the qualitative information to code, to pull out themes. This was very difficult to do because so much of what was being expressed was vulnerable, it was raw, it was just very generous also to share this level of reflection with us through a survey. Many often said, just thanking us for providing them a space to talk about what was being experienced. So in some ways, the survey itself feels like an intervention that we were able to provide an opportunity for folks not to be invisible, but to really share about what they're experiencing in the moment, what they're coping with, what they're hoping for. And so I wanted to kind of just underscore that because this isn't work that we approach from an objective stance. And so for us to, as you mentioned, Imam Abdul-Malik, that this woman, although the images that were presented with the quotes are not of the actual participants, right? Their identity is anonymous. But for that, we know folks in our lives, right? If not us, in fact, who have felt similarly, who are going through these kinds of experiences. And so I think it's worth kind of honoring and lifting up the fact that there's something to be said about how much people were willing to share with us, again, through an anonymous confidential survey that really spoke to just how difficult and overwhelming, right, this experience is. So we also wanted to look at how are people coping, right? We have the backdrop again of white supremacy, of anti-Black racism, of structural inequities, of these impact domains of financial health, psychospiritual well-being, family and community well-being, and physical health. How are people coping? And that was the next question that we explored, and were able to pull out themes from the qualitative information provided. And so the coping strategies fell in one of four categories. And of course, there's overlap. But these were the themes that emerged from what was shared with us: problem-focused coping, meaning-focused coping, emotion-focused, and then social support. What do we mean by that? So the problem-focused coping strategies really relate to a feeling of personal efficacy, right? What can I do? How can I tackle this issue of keeping myself safe, of adhering to proper CDC guidelines, of social distancing, of exercising? And this we saw in how people were able to express, you know, I can't stop the virus, right? But there are things that I can do personally in order to minimize my risk. Meaning-focused coping has to do with reliance on faith and spirituality as a source of strength, but also to make meaning of this suffering, of this experience that feels so incredibly challenging. There was also meaning derived from racial identity, right? What is this? What has previous experiences historically meant for how I make meaning of my present? And that being a source of resilience and pride. Third, looking at emotion-focused coping, how are people managing these difficult feelings? Many talked about reaching out to therapists, seeking mental health support, and also at times simply acknowledging, this is heavy, this is a lot, this is overwhelming, I feel really challenged, right? Or I'm not coping well. So that speaks to, you know, how are people acknowledging the emotions that they're also experiencing at the same time? And then finally, social support, looking at family and friends. Who am I relying on in my network? How am I both practicing physical distance while remaining socially close to those I love? And so this, again, pulling directly from the responses, the qualitative responses from the survey, this is an example of problem-focused coping, right? Personal efficacy. What can I do in order to minimize my risk? The 60-year-old West African Muslim man said, I'm strongly following the personal hygiene, social distancing, and stay home guidelines as recommended by government and health agencies. A 52-year-old African-American Muslim woman said, I exercise high levels of conscientiousness with respect to wearing a mask in public, washing my hands, cleansing all groceries and delivered boxes, etc. I'm taking extreme measures to protect myself, but I refuse to be bound by total fear. I am cautious. So meaning-focused coping also emerged as a very significant thread throughout the qualitative responses that we gathered. And Imam Abdulmalik, I wanted to pull you in to share the reflections that were offered, but also provide some additional context for the importance of meaning-focused coping for African Americans.
Religious specifically part of the coping. So many people in our community, both Muslim and Christian, were able to find meaning and stability and goals out of their religious. And so out of the religious communities they come from, whether it was the church or the mosque. And so many transition from physically going to their religious institutions to transitioning online. Some people were able to dig inward and find new practices, as well as new approaches to how they found it and how they practice. And some people, amazingly so, were able to even find themselves stronger in their faith and in their practice, both faith and practice, because of COVID. And so religion and philosophical worldview played a big part in helping people experience COVID, but also persevere despite of the challenges that we have.
And so this is what some of those meaning-focused coping responses sounded like. This 29-year-old African-American Christian woman said, I think about what my ancestors had to go through as slaves, then as Black people in America. If they can get through that, then I have the ability to persevere through this. That keeps me upbeat and optimistic. A 51-year-old African-American Muslim man said, as a Muslim and with Ramadan observance in the midst of COVID-19, life is more peaceful. It helps and redirects my focus away from the news and images of death. A 61-year-old, not 601, a 61-year-old African-American Muslim man said, in spite of all the death, sickness, and trauma people are experiencing, not only here in America, but all over the world, one thing is certain: God is in control. And the 70-year-old African-American Christian man said, I am one who believes in being content with my lot. And so I have the faithful stamina that says I can get through and overcome anything. This 50-year-old African-American Muslim man said, I accept the qadr, or the divine wisdom or decree of Allah, God, and know that with difficulty comes relief. So the third area, the first two being problem-focused coping, like what can I do in my own life in order to minimize my risk and keep myself safe? And meaning-focused coping, how do I understand this level of suffering, this level of incredible tragedy and death and loss of life? The third area was emotion-focused coping. How do I acknowledge what I'm feeling? How do I understand the best ways to deal with all of those heavy emotions? A 71-year-old African-American Christian woman said, I'm resting and spending time with family. Additionally, I have weekly meetings with my therapist over Zoom, who is an African-American. A 30-year-old African-American Muslim woman said, my coping strategies have fluctuated throughout the weeks. At times, I dive into work on my business. Other times, I spend too much time numbing with social media. I understand that all these fluctuations have their place, but I am aware that a part of me is keeping certain feelings at bay. I want to cry, but I haven't slowed down enough to do so. In terms of the last area of coping being social support, this 21-year-old Black African Muslim man said, mentally and emotionally, I'm trying to stay connected, to be there for my family and my friends virtually. I love my family and they're extremely supportive, but being away from college and high school friends for this long is weighing on me. 24-year-old African-American Muslim woman shared, seeing my family and partner brings me much needed joy during these times as I live alone in a studio apartment. I do lots of reading, resting, and occasionally yoga, also making sure I'm well fed. So we were able to pull themes of problem-focused coping, of meaning-focused coping, meaning how do people rely on faith and identity in order to manage the difficulty of this moment, and then also emotion-focused, really being able to acknowledge those difficult feelings, and finally social support, relying on family, friends, and loved ones to provide respite, essentially, and connection, even though physically distant. And what we also have to acknowledge at the same time, so this is when we have to sort of put on a perspective of both and, right? Those coping strategies absolutely indicate or highlight and demonstrate how resilient African Americans have been, that despite these, or in spite of the structural inequities, the racial violence, the racial trauma, able to engage and utilize a variety of different strategies, right? And not just one, like there were those who said, you know, I talked to a therapist, I spend time with family and friends, I exercise, I'm able to adhere to the guidelines. So again, employing those four major coping strategies, this is the and part. That level of coping, which is also called John Henryism, is high effort coping, meaning that the stressful, damaging health impact of thriving despite equality, financial hardship, and racial discrimination, John Henryism. So some of us may know the story of John Henry, kind of like a folk hero, a Black man that was sort of challenged as a laborer. And what this indicates, Dr. Sherman James sort of coined this phrase many decades ago, but looking at what does it do to one's body physically? What is the physical health impact of having to thrive despite inequality, hardship, discrimination? And this is constant, right? Because we're living in a system of white supremacy, which is, according to Bell Hooks, is not designed for us to be well. Yet there are successes, there is resilience, there is strength, and it takes a toll. And so it looks like this, right? John Henryism and the life-threatening stress affecting Black people in America. In America, Black people are 2 to 4 times more likely to develop heart-related problems by age 50, and systemic racism may be to blame. It is the hidden health impact of race inequality. The stress of racial inequality can be deadly, right? So in this article, there was an exploration of how those health consequences are directly linked, right, or correlated with what does it mean for individuals, for Black folks to thrive despite and simultaneously be impacted by disparities which impact physical and emotional well-being and that of the community. In addition to John Henryism and this high effort coping, there's also a concept called vigilant coping. And that refers to individuals who potentially as a result of experiencing discrimination in the past, proactively prepare for the possibility that they will be discriminated against again, right, in the future or mistreated because of their race. So we have this high effort coping, right? Despite the challenges, I'm going to do well, I'm going to succeed, I'm going to be faithful, I'm going to be grounded in who and what I am, and constantly having to anticipate and then proactively prepare one's body, right, one's mind, one's spirit, to cope with future transgressions, with future acts of violence. There is, again, related to that racial trauma. What does it mean for us to be living within a global pandemic, which is disproportionately impacting this community? And according to the American the APM Research Lab, American Media, almost 20,000 Black Americans would still be alive today if we were dying at the same rate as white Americans, right? So this vigilant coping, this high effort coping takes a toll on our physical and mental health. It takes a toll on our communities. And, right, we are demonstrating at the same time what it means to deploy all of these strategies in order to try and remain well, right? To try and cope with really seemingly overwhelming odds. So this is how we've tried to represent all of the information or some of the major findings that we were able to gather from this work. There's a lot here, so I'm going to pull out what I think it's important to note, that what you see around the border is white supremacy and anti-Black racism. That is always present. That is the context. That is what all of the inequities are grounded in, and they're structural, they're systemic. So this is not about just simply interpersonal interactions. It's not just about the individual experience, but collectively, right? That these inequities predate a global pandemic. And pulling out, again, just 4 areas in which Black communities are impacted. We could talk about medical apartheid, right? Health-related disparities, scientific racism. It is not that Black folks are predisposed or somehow predisposed or genetically to contracting coronavirus. There are disparities that are built in centuries, over centuries of time, which leaves us more vulnerable. Secondly, thinking about the carceral state, and by this is again a system of ideology, of behavior, of law that contributes to the over-policing, the surveillance, the monitoring, the detention, the incarceration of Black folks. And where we see this as an example is why people are very, very wary of contact tracing, the same technology that's used for contact tracing, and to be able to determine, well, if there is an outbreak, say in a certain city, where did that outbreak originate? Same technology is used for suspicionless surveillance of communities, particularly Black Muslim communities, of those who are activists, who are deemed by the government to be, quote, Black identity extremists. So we have every right to be, understandably so, given the history, given the present moment, to be wary. And so we're also seeing high proportions of Black incarcerated individuals who are becoming exposed and infected with COVID. Thirdly, looking at the psychic violence, of brutality, of racial trauma, of race-based traumatic stress, constantly having an impact, present before the pandemic. And lastly, thinking about economic inequalities, right? The distribution of labor, the wage gap, that so many of our respondents were also identified as essential workers, right? Those who could not work from home. And so every time they left their home, worried and shared with us, you know, my husband is a first responder. I'm worried about him bringing something home to us. We have a 5-year-old son. Or what happens if I do go back to work and there aren't sufficient measures put in place in order to protect me? And again, as a result of structural inequities that are then producing these economic inequalities. And so then you see these, again, these layers. So we have the inequities in these 4 major areas, and we were looking at the impact domains, right? It's impacting our community's physical health, family and community well-being, psycho-spiritual well-being, and financial health. And the ways that folks are attempting to cope, right? These COVID coping strategies are problem-focused, meaning-focused, emotion-focused, and through social support. Yet, right, and these are examples of high effort coping, of vigilant coping. And so what you see is that there are arrows, right? Even from the bottom, right, which again, along the border says white supremacy and anti-Black racism, that is also contributing to the why. The why are Black folks utilizing so many, right, significant coping strategies? Yes, very resourceful, finding meaning in suffering, being able to rely on faith and spirituality and identity, personal efficacy, acknowledging difficult emotions, and also relying on friends and loved ones, family members. Yet again, what does it mean for Black community members who are dying at a higher rate to constantly have to deploy these strategies in order to survive, right? This is the impact that we're seeing. It is the themes that emerged in the work, and something I think we have to sit with, right? Even just visually, right? This image, there's a lot happening. And what I want to sort of offer is that if we're perhaps overwhelmed by a visual depiction of data that was gathered, right, over the course of 6 to 8 weeks, if visually we're feeling overwhelmed, there's a lot to process, a lot to understand, imagine, right, the lived experience of community members who are trying to process the impact in all of those domains, trying to understand the structural inequities. Many of our respondents were very astute, right? They were able to say, what I'm experiencing is a result of the incompetence of this administration. It is a result of white supremacy. It is a result of police brutality. It is a manifestation of anti-Blackness. So our respondents were able to articulate that, no, this is not a personal failing. It is not me being sort of individually or personally vulnerable to COVID-19. I understand what they told us. I understand that there is something larger pre-existing that is now making my experience of this pandemic intensified in a negative way. So, Dr. Bediako, I would like for you to speak to, just briefly, again, as the quantitative expert on this team, some of the limitations that we also faced collecting incredible information, but there are always limitations.
Sure. And I think that's one of the things that I wanted to start off with is that there were, given the context, given the time pressures, and the grassroots nature of this, which is not a negative thing by any stretch of the imagination, I do want to say that there are a number of strengths in this study that I think the webinar has already demonstrated. But with respect to some of the methodological limitations of it, obviously this is not a random sample of participants. So this was a convenient sample. We got word out to people by word of mouth, through emails, through websites. So this doesn't represent a random sample. One of the other limitations is that instead of using structured interviews, again, if we had had more resources and support, we had to rely on self-report. So again, we're left to infer the meanings of a lot of these comments and for the quantitative data as well, because we didn't have the ability to follow up with people to gain a deeper understanding of what they meant. Third limitation is with respect to gender diversity. So again, this is predominantly a female sample. And I think going forward, we would want to make sure to include more male participants to get a better picture of what the male experience during this COVID pandemic has been like. And again, just to keep in mind that this is just the particular responses at a specific point in time. So there are shifting landscapes. Now that we are more than 6 months into what people would consider the quarantine phase of this experience, some folks' responses may be quite different today than they were back in May and June. So this is just a snapshot. We always have to think about context, and given the volatility that has gone on politically with respect to religious issues and some of the civic issues that are going on as well, we just want to put that in the backdrop, that this is a particular snapshot of what's going on at a specific point in time.
Imam Malik, I just want to pull you in and also to, I guess, inquire about if you have any thoughts about perhaps related to religious and spiritual diversity, but also coping, if there were any limitations methodologically that you were able to identify.
There methodological limitations to religiosity, because this was qualitative, we were just really asking people how they felt. And so I'm not the expert here, and I trust you all's expertise in this one. But perhaps even an individual study for this, using some qualitative samples, or perhaps even some other levels of religious evaluation that could have been used, perhaps could have expanded this more. But I think what we have is amazing and a wonderful start.
Okay. So now moving to recommendations for future research. Again, Dr. Bediako, if you could lead that portion.
Yeah, some of the things that we might want to think about doing is to recruit a cohort of people over time and to follow them over time to look at the long-term impact of COVID, both on their health, but also on their social networks and social relationships. Given the impact, the disparate impact that this has had on elders, this would be one of the key things that I think would be necessary for future research. And also one of the things that kind of has gone under the radar is the long-term impact of this on young people and emerging adults. So a second recommendation is to kind of turn towards the religious leaders themselves. I've seen over the past couple of weeks a number of stories that are coming out in the popular media and the newspapers in particular about the role of religious leaders, and almost 99% of what I'm seeing focuses on pastors or on churches. And so I think that there's a better need to understand how religious leaders in various faith traditions, particularly in the Muslim community, are responding to the needs of their community members outside or beyond their spiritual needs, but really thinking about how they position themselves as religious and spiritual leaders to respond to both the short and long-term health needs of people in their religious communities. And then finally, recommendation is to be able to procure some tangible resources that can be allocated to help people who are having behavioral health challenges. Again, as Dr. Kameelah has shown, there are multiple layers and multiple dimensions that people are coping with. And overall, people are using whatever they can to be able to, adjust and adapt and make it through this process. But what we don't know is what are going to be the long-term implications of trying to sustain that momentum, and how do people replenish their mental health services or replenish their mental health. And so being able to connect people with services and provide resources that's going to allow them to be supported with mental health and behavioral health issues is going to be critical going forward.
And also, Imam Abdulmalik, are there any specific areas of like future research that you would be particularly interested in exploring?
Yeah, I would love to just really build out some of the religious impact, but so some evaluated levels and things that already exist in, just to even more so drill home some of the findings that we had in this one, but also how, looking on point number 2, how religious leaders were successful or failed in this time to provide sufficient solutions and religious outlets for their respective communities. And so we found, as was found in our data, lots of people turned online. They turned to things. Were those sufficient? How could they have improved? Were there workshop of ideas and tangible, spiritual, practical things that helped? And then how could religion be used for the emotional growth in challenging times like these? And so really just building that out more would be amazing.
Great. And I would just like to add, I think from the, from the psychological perspective, I think normalizing, really enhancing understanding of that emotion-focused coping, and the fact that people are coping and not always in a positive way. That there were respondents who also said that they were really struggling, that they were eating more or drinking more, or avoiding kind of discussion about the impact in their lives. And so, again, dealing with the pandemic of racial violence that is producing a level of trauma, that this pandemic is also producing a level of trauma simultaneously, right? They're constantly interacting. And so being able to have conversations in all kinds of spaces, and particularly in our religious spaces, about historical, intergenerational trauma, how we carry that in both our minds and spirits and our bodies, and really having that be a conversation that people feel very comfortable having, and from looking at the rate of the increase in suicidality in Black adolescents, recently it's actually increasing, and that being one example, right, of how people are struggling, and so I would hope that in the future, in terms of sort of intervention, that we can absolutely have conversations about what does it mean to sit with these levels of trauma within a system of white supremacy in which I am not expected to be well. I think that's an ongoing conversation. We wanted to leave some time. I know we're short on time, but I recognize that this is a lot to sit with. We will make this information, this data available. And there was a question about, I believe you answered it, Dr. Bediako, but a question about significant differences between Christians and Muslims with regards to geography or income. So if you could just reiterate sort of your response to that.
Yes. So the Muslim respondents that we had, they came, well, overall, we had respondents from about 32 different states and the District of Columbia. When we looked at how those were broken down by the two religious groups, we saw a lot of common states of origin as far as geographic dispersion. So, for example, for Muslims, the top states that people came from, and none of these states had more than 10%. So the most popular state was Pennsylvania for Muslims, which was about 9.6%. And then Maryland came in second, 9.3%. Then New York, California, Virginia, Georgia, Michigan, and North Carolina for Muslims. For Christians, the top state of respondents was New York, followed by Pennsylvania, followed by Georgia, North Carolina, California, Texas, Maryland, Virginia. So there's a lot of overlap between the two groups with respect to their geographic residence. I don't recall that we asked a question about income. I could be mistaken, but I don't recall us having that question. Again, partly because given that this was, an open-ended survey, an anonymous survey, a lot of times people don't feel comfortable asking questions about income. And also, we weren't able to verify anything that people would respond with respect to income. So I believe that we omitted that question from the survey.
The other question that I had, perhaps that you could, maybe elaborate, is if based on and I don't know if you indicated this earlier, but the average age of the respondents?
Yes, I have that in front of me. I did not specifically talk about that, but on average, the average age of Muslim participants was about 39.4 years. And for Christian participants, the average age was 41.8 years. And that was a statistically significant difference as well. There was on average, Christian respondents were about 2 years older than Muslims. So in terms of the full range of respondents from both groups, we had people as young as 17 who responded to the survey, and people who indicated that they were 82 completed the survey. So the range went from 17 to 82 years, but on average, Muslim participants were a little bit shy of 40, and Christian participants were about 42 years old.
Okay. So we just have a few minutes left, but I wondered if there were any, for you, Imam Abdulmalik or Dr. Bediako, if there were any sort of just kind of takeaways, comments or reflections that you are, that you had or have overall about what we were able to gather.
For me, with respect to what we were able to gather, it really just kind of impressed upon me about generating and sparking new questions. So, looking at the data so much as I have over the past couple of months, really the biggest concern for me is to really think about these long-term implications and what does this mean? But also kind of what was alluded to earlier, what will it mean when things start to open up again? How soon, I think as a country, we tend to have a very short memory about things. And I'm wondering, how the issues and concerns that have really manifested themselves as a result of people being forced to see, in some ways, aspects and elements of the Black experience that they're not accustomed to seeing, I'm
Mm,
wondering how soon or how long we will keep momentum and shine the light on those issues,
mm,
or whether, in 6 months' time, when things go back to quote unquote normal, will we also push onto the periphery and marginalize a lot of these issues around equity, around justice,
mm.
and around privilege?
Absolutely right. I think that's always kind of the concern that's sort of lingering, right? That there's this surge in interest and momentum, even sometimes in funding, kind of corporate funding, when Black folks are living, right, with the consequences, both past and present, of what this means. So this isn't like a moment for us. This isn't sort of, you know, just a result of kind of this media attention or increased conversation. But we know, right, from just our history that we are trying to reconcile the consequences on a daily basis, right? Um, and for you, Imam Abdulmalik.
Likewise, looking at as things grow on, how like if we were to do a round two of this, what would be the religious implications of this wearing in on us spiritually as well and emotionally? How has this changed us? Well, we did the survey very early on, and honestly, in the heat of Ramadan. So, was
Mm,
Ramadan a big factor in allowing people to cope spiritually from the Muslim community specifically? Were we able to thrive or cope or whatever language we like to use? And then now that Ramadan is over and we've gone past the second Eid al-Adha, and Hajj is done, how have we coped and how are we surviving despite of the highs of our spiritual seasons being
mm,
over? Likewise, starting with school starting back up. I have little children, two of which are going to be in school at home. How is that going to impact us? As it's one thing to finish off a school year at home and to have aspirations and hope of a future coming, but now with school starting back up, what does that do to our hope and ability to have um, imagination and creativity of wellness when
mm.
things look like they are getting worse? And so those are some things I'd be interested
And so I would say, just kind of in conclusion, that it's definitely highlighted for me, again, the complexity of the challenges that our communities face. Um, something that has been known, but to see it visually depicted, to hear and read some very heart-wrenching sort of testimonies of how people are surviving and trying to make meaning. Um, I'm always again filled with incredible pride and awe for how Black people live, right? How people live despite. Yet I'm also incredibly concerned about the toll it takes for us to live under these conditions. Um, and so, I love my people. I am proud to be a part of this community. I have absolute faith in the mercy and the justice of the Creator. Um, and I also remain concerned. And so with that, it's, perhaps my sort of meaning focused coping is to think about the fact that there's always a reckoning from the Creator. At what point it will come, I have no knowledge of that. But I do believe that it will. And so for those who are struggling, who are overwhelmed, who perhaps in silence, or really unsure as to what will help get from day to day. Hopefully some aspects of this presentation provide ideas for how to do so, reaching out to family and friends, relying on faith if that is an area that is important or resonant, being able to think about what can I do in my own life in order to protect myself and my loved ones. And to also think about the reaching out to a mental health professional. If folks would like to reach out to us in order to get more information, or if there are questions or comments or just kind of reflections, we can be reached at this information here, blackcovidsurvey.com, Muslim Wellness Foundation. It's actually, the website is muslimwellness.com, or the Black Muslim Coalition, or send an email to info@muslimwellness.com. And inshallah, God willing, we will be able to disseminate this information to many folks who are curious about sort of the nuance and the types of ways that Black folks are coping, and also what are some of the barriers to surviving and kind of thriving and making meaning of this moment. So thank you to everyone who joined in. Thank you to the team, Dr. Bediako and Imam Abdulmalik. This was certainly, I think, as you began, Dr. Bediako, this was a collective effort. It was a labor of love, but one in which I am incredibly grateful and humbled to have been a part of. So inshallah, God willing, we'll make these results available through our social media platforms, but also you can contact us directly. And with that, say assalamu alaikum, have a good evening, and take care.
So